Everyone tells you to reach out more. Call them, text them. Don't be so proud. That's what they say. As if pride is the problem. As if loneliness is just a scheduling error that can be corrected with enough effort and the right tone of voice. I listened to that advice longer than I care to admit. Long enough to watch myself slowly turn into someone I did not recognize. I am 91 years old, which is old enough to know the difference between something that is difficult and something that is wrong. Calling your children and not hearing back is difficult. Calling them again and again and again until your day begins to orbit around whether or not your phone lights up. That is something else. That is a quiet kind of surrender. I used to sit at the kitchen table, with my phone placed just to the right of my teacup, not in my hand, not clutched like a lifeline, nothing so dramatic. Just close enough that I could see it without looking like I was waiting. There is a dignity to pretending you are not waiting. I held on to that longer than I should have. My son Michael is a good man. Let me start there because I want to be fair. He works hard, he has responsibilities. A life that is full in ways I remember clearly and do not envy. My daughter Patricia is the same, capable, intelligent, constantly in motion. I did not raise careless children. I raised busy ones. That distinction matters more than people think. Busy children do not forget you all at once. They forget you in increments. A missed call becomes a returned message hours later. Hours become days. Days become a pattern that nobody names because naming it would require someone to do something about it. And most people, when faced with something that requires effort without immediate consequence, choose to wait. I became something that could wait. The first time I noticed it, truly noticed it, was not during some dramatic moment. There was no argument, no harsh words, no obvious neglect. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had made a pie. Apple. From scratch. The way my mother taught me when I was younger than Patricia is now. The kind of pie that fills the house with a smell that feels like an invitation. I thought, I will call them. Not both. I am not unreasonable, just Michael. He lives closer. I told him about the pie, lightly, the way you learn to say things when you do not want to sound like you need anyone. I made too much, I said. You should come by, if you have time. If you have time. That is the language of someone trying not to be a burden. He said he would try. Now when someone says they will try, what they often mean is that they would like the credit for intending to come, without the obligation of actually doing it. I knew that. I've known that for decades. But I said thank you anyway, because hope makes you participate in small deceptions. I set the table for two, not in a hopeful way, in a practical way, I told myself. Plates are easier to put out before everything cools. I poured tea into the second cup, just to see the steam rise from both. There is something about symmetry that feels like company, even when it is not. He did not come. He texted, of course. They always text. Sorry, Mom, today got away from me. Rain check. Rain check. Such a cheerful phrase for something that never seems to arrive. I ate the pie. Not all of it. I am not reckless, but enough to understand that the problem was not the pie. It was good. I have been making pies for 70 years. I know when one is good. After that, I began to notice things I had previously explained away. How often I adjusted my words before speaking, trimming them down to something easier to receive. How quickly I said, I'm fine, before anyone had the chance to ask a second question. How carefully I avoided mentioning anything that might require effort from someone else. I thought I was being considerate. What I was actually doing was teaching the people around me that I required very little. And people believe what you teach them. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being loved but not included. It is not loud. It does not announce itself in ways that demand attention. It settles in quietly, rearranging your expectations until you no longer expect much of anything at all. That is where the danger is. Because once you expect nothing, you stop asking. And when you stop asking, the silence around you begins to feel normal. Not painful, not even particularly sad, just normal. like a room that has always been slightly dim, so you forget that brighter rooms exist. I lived in that dimness longer than I should have. And then one day, without warning, I saw it clearly. It was not because of something my children did. That is important. We like to believe that change comes from outside, from some event that forces us to reconsider everything. But more often, it comes from a moment so small, you could miss it if you were not paying attention. I was standing at the sink, washing a cup I had already washed once. I do that sometimes, not because it needs it, but because repetition fills space. And I realized that I had checked my phone 6 times in the span of 10 minutes. 6 times. Not because it rang, not because it buzzed, but because I had begun to measure my existence against its silence. That is when I understood something I wish I had understood years earlier. If you keep reaching for people who are not reaching for you, you do not become closer, you become smaller. And I had spent a lifetime becoming something solid, something real. I was not going to spend the end of it dissolving into someone who waited by a screen for evidence that she still mattered. So I made a decision. Not a loud one, not the kind you announce or explain or justify. Just a quiet, deliberate shift in the way I moved through my own life. I stopped begging. I did not stop all at once. That would make for a cleaner story, but it would not be true. Change, at least the kind that lasts, rarely arrives in a single decisive moment. It comes in small adjustments that feel almost insignificant at the time, and only reveal their importance when you look back and realize you are no longer the person you were. The first thing I changed was where I kept my phone. For years, it had lived in the center of my day, placed carefully within reach, angled just so, as if its position might influence whether it chose to ring. I moved it into the kitchen drawer. Not permanently. I am old, not unreasonable, but far enough away that I could not see it unless I made the decision to look. That distinction matters. There is a difference between responding to something and waiting for it. I had been waiting. The second thing I changed was more difficult because it required me to admit something I had been avoiding. I had built my days around the possibility of interruption. I left spaces open, not for myself, but for the chance that someone else might fill them. I told myself this was flexibility. It was not. It was availability in its most one-sided form. So I began to fill those spaces deliberately, not with distractions. That is important. Distractions pass time. They do not give it shape. I wanted shape. I started small. One thing each morning that required my full attention. Not something impressive. Not something I could report back to anyone as evidence that I was doing well. Just something that was mine. I reorganized a drawer that had not been touched in years. I took everything out, one piece at a time, and decided what still belonged in my life, and what did not. It is a simple task, but there is a quiet honesty in deciding what you keep. I cooked meals that required patience, not because I needed the food, but because I needed the process. There is a difference between eating and preparing something that takes time to become what it is meant to be. I began to notice things again. The way the light moved across the kitchen floor in the late afternoon, stretching itself thin before disappearing entirely. The sound of the house settling in the evening, not as an emptiness, but as a kind of rhythm I had never taken the time to hear. And something unexpected happened. The silence began to change. It did not disappear. I am not interested in pretending that loneliness can be erased by a few good habits and a shift in perspective. That is not how it works. But the silence stopped feeling like a judgment. It became instead a space I could use. That was new. For a long time, I had treated my days as something to endure until someone else entered them. Now, slowly, they became something I was building, piece by piece, without waiting for permission. It was during one of these mornings, when I was standing by the window, trying to decide whether the plant on the sill needed more water or less, that I noticed her. My neighbor. She had moved in months earlier, but I had not paid much attention. Not out of disinterest, but because I had grown accustomed to not inserting myself into other people's lives. It seemed polite, it seemed appropriate. It also, I would later realize, kept me separate in a way that was no longer serving me. She was standing outside her front door, holding a bag in one hand and her phone in the other, looking at both as though neither one contained what she needed. There was a child inside. I could hear her, asking questions in that relentless musical way children have, where every answer leads immediately to another question. The woman did not respond right away. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment, I recognized something. But the expression. It was the look of someone who is holding too many things at once and has no place to set them down. I had worn that look myself, years ago, when my children were small, and my days were full in a way that felt endless. Back then, I would have given anything for 5 minutes of quiet that did not require me to earn it. And there she was, standing just a few steps away, looking as though 5 minutes might be the difference between continuing and unraveling. I could have looked away. That would have been the version of me from a few months earlier. The one who believed that staying out of the way was the same as being considerate. The one who had practiced making herself smaller so well that it had become automatic. But something had shifted. When you stop begging for attention, you begin to notice where your attention might actually matter. So I did something I had not done in a long time. I stepped outside. It was not dramatic. I did not have a speech prepared or a clear intention beyond a simple instinct that said, "Go." I walked across the small stretch of grass that separated our houses and stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to give her the option of ignoring me if she wanted to. "You look like you could use a minute," I said. She blinked, as if she had been pulled out of a place she had not realized she was in. She started, and then stopped. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I could." So we stood there, not talking, not solving anything, just standing in the same space, without expectation. The child's voice continued from inside the house, rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested urgency without actual consequence. After a while, she laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised more than amused, the kind that escapes before you decide whether it is appropriate. I don't even know why I'm overwhelmed. Nothing is actually wrong. "That's usually when it happens," I replied, "when nothing is wrong, but everything is still too much." She looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to place me in a category that made sense. Neighbor, stranger, old woman. None of them quite fit what was happening. "I'm Annika," she said. I told her my name. The conversation did not last long. It did not need to. Some interactions are not meant to carry weight. They are simply meant to exist. But as I walked back to my house, I realized something had changed again. For months, I had been focused on what I was not receiving. Now, for the first time in a long while, I had given something without measuring what might come back. And it felt different. Not better exactly. Better suggests comparison, and I was no longer interested in comparing my life to what it had been or what I thought it should be. It felt real, and real, I was beginning to understand, was far more valuable than full. The next time I saw her, she knocked. Not loudly, not the kind of knock that assumes permission. It was careful, almost tentative, as if she was prepared for the possibility that I might not answer, or worse, that I might and wish she hadn't come. I opened the door without asking who it was. At my age, you learn the difference between a knock that carries urgency and one that carries uncertainty. This one was the second kind. "Hi," she said, standing there with a small, apologetic smile. "I hope this isn't strange." "It might be," I said, "but that doesn't mean it's unwelcome." She laughed at that, the same surprised laugh as before, and held up a container. "I made too much," she said, "and I thought maybe you'd like some." It was pasta, nothing complicated. The kind of meal you make when you are tired, but still trying to do something that resembles care. I took it from her and stepped aside. "Come in," I said. She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to consider whether accepting would create an obligation she was not ready for. Then she nodded and walked in, glancing around in that quick, subtle way people do when they are trying to understand a space without appearing to study it. "It smells nice in here," she said. "I cooked earlier," I replied, out of habit. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent so many afternoons waiting for something to happen. It looked different now, though nothing about it had changed. That is another thing no one tells you. The meaning of a place can shift entirely without moving a single object. Her daughter was with her this time. Lena, she told me, 4 years old and very certain about most things. Lena stood near the doorway at first, observing me with a seriousness that felt almost professional. "Are you old?" she asked. "Very." She nodded, satisfied, and walked further into the room as though a necessary condition had been met. Children, I have found, are far more comfortable with direct truths than adults. They do not require softness, where clarity will do. We ate the pasta together, though I insisted on putting it on proper plates. Eating from containers feels temporary, and I was no longer interested in temporary. At first, the conversation stayed near the surface. Work, schedules, the small logistics of daily life that people use to orient themselves with each other. But surface conversations have a way of thinning out quickly when neither person is particularly interested in maintaining them. It was Lena who shifted it. "My mom is always tired," she announced, with the blunt authority of someone who has no reason to soften her observations. Anika closed her eyes briefly. "Lena, it's all right," I said. "Being tired is not a secret." Anika exhaled, a small release of something she had been holding in place. "I didn't think it showed that much," she said. "It shows just enough," I replied. "Not to everyone, just to the people who recognize it." She looked at me then, and something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else. But I saw it. Recognition. That is what had been missing from my life, I realized. Not attention, not constant contact. Recognition. The simple, steady experience of being seen as you are, without explanation. "I didn't expect this stage of my life to feel like this," she said after a while. "I thought I would have things more figured out." "You just get better at carrying what you haven't figured out." She smiled at that, but there was something behind it. "Do you ever feel like you're doing everything and still falling behind?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but not in the way you mean." She waited. "When you're young," I continued, "falling behind feels like you're missing something you're supposed to catch. A milestone, a moment, a version of your life that exists somewhere ahead of you if you just move fast enough." "And when you're older," she asked. "It feels like you're being slowly moved out of the center of things," I said. "Not because you did anything wrong, just because the world rearranges itself without asking you where you'd like to stand." She was quiet after that. Lena had wandered into the living room, her voice drifting back to us in fragments of imagined conversations with invisible companions. "I don't want that," Anika said finally. "No one does," I replied, "but wanting has very little to do with it." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but full. "I think that's why I came over," she admitted. "Not for the food. I mean partly for the food, but mostly because when you said what you said the other day, it felt like you understood something I didn't know how to explain." "I did," I said. "I do." "And how do you fix it?" she asked. I shook my head. "You don't," I said. "You stop trying to fix it." She frowned slightly, the way people do when an answer does not match the shape of their question. "That doesn't sound very helpful," she said. "It isn't," I agreed. "Not immediately." I stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing my cup more out of habit than necessity. The water ran steadily, a quiet background to something that felt like it required the right words. "When you spend your life trying to be included," I said, "you make other people responsible for your sense of belonging. And people are not very good at carrying responsibilities they didn't choose." She watched me, listening in that focused way that is becoming increasingly rare. So what do you do instead? She asked. You build a life that does not require constant permission to exist, I said. She leaned back slightly, considering that. And that works? She asked. It works differently, I replied, which is sometimes the only kind of working that's available. That was the beginning. Not of a friendship, though that came later. Not of a solution, because I am suspicious of anything that presents itself that way. It was the beginning of something more useful. A shift away from waiting to being involved, not in a grand, impressive sense, but in the small, consistent way that makes a day feel like it belongs to you. Lena began to visit in the afternoons, not through any formal arrangement, just a quiet understanding that formed without needing to be discussed. She would come in, drop her small bag by the door, and immediately begin asking questions that required answers I had not considered in years. Why do old pictures look sad? She asked once. They're not sad, I said. They just remember things we don't. She accepted that without argument and moved on to something else, as children do, but I sat with the question long after she had forgotten it. Annika came too, when she could. Sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes longer. She would sit at the table, shoulders slightly lowered, as if the act of being there allowed her to set something down, even if only temporarily. And I realized something I had not expected. I was no longer thinking about whether my phone had rung. It happened so gradually that I almost missed it. The absence of waiting. Not the absence of my children, because they were still living their lives in the same way they always had, calling when they could, meaning well in the spaces between. That did not change overnight. What changed was the way their absence no longer defined the shape of my days. There is a difference between being alone and organizing your life around who is not there. For a long time, I had done the second. Now, without announcing it, without even fully deciding it in words, I have begun to do the first. My days had weight again. Not the heavy kind, not the kind that presses down on you, but the kind that settles you into yourself. Mornings were no longer something to get through. They were something to begin. Afternoons were no longer long stretches of empty time. They had edges, texture, small expectations that belonged only to me. Lena would arrive with questions. Always questions. Why do plants need light? So they know which way to grow, I told her. Do people need that too? Yes, I said, but we forget to look for it. She considered that in the serious way she considered everything, then nodded, as if she had added it to some internal collection of truths she would return to later. We baked often, not because it was necessary, but because it required attention, and attention is one of the purest forms of presence I know. She would stand on a chair, measuring things with great importance, occasionally spilling more than she used, and I would let her, because precision can be learned later, but interest must be protected early. Annika would sit at the table, sometimes watching, sometimes just being still. I don't remember the last time I sat without doing something, she said once. You're doing something, I replied. What? You're being here. It sounds simple, but most people don't manage it. She smiled, but she did not argue. That became our rhythm. Not planned, not structured, just repeated often enough that it became part of all of our lives. And in that rhythm, something in me strengthened. Not in the way people talk about strength, with effort and determination and visible progress. This was quieter, more stable, like a foundation you stop noticing because it no longer feels uncertain. I stopped thinking about whether my children should call more. Not because I had convinced myself they shouldn't, but because I had removed that question from the center of my life. It still existed, but it no longer decided how I felt when I woke up in the morning, or how I understood my place in the world. That is the part no one explains to you. When you stop begging, it is not just your behavior that changes, it is your position. You are no longer standing at the edge of someone else's life, hoping to be invited in. You are standing in your own, fully, whether anyone arrives or not. And strangely, that is what people respond to. Michael called one afternoon while I was in the middle of explaining to Lena why the moon sometimes appears during the day. I let it ring, not to prove a point, not to teach him anything, simply because I was occupied. I called him back later. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I tried you earlier." "I know," I replied. "I was busy." There was a small pause. Busy. It is a word I had not used for myself in a long time. "Oh," he said. "What were you doing?" "I was with Lena," I said. "We were talking about the moon." "The moon," he repeated, a hint of a smile in his voice. "It's still there, in case you were wondering." He laughed, and something in that conversation shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious if you were not paying attention. But I heard it. Curiosity. He asked more questions, about Lena, about Annika, about what I had been doing with my time. Not out of obligation, but out of interest. Interest is different from responsibility. He came by that weekend, not because I asked. I did not mention the pie I had baked or the soup I had made. I simply told him I would be home. When he arrived, Lena was in the backyard, explaining the rules of a game she had invented, to no one in particular. Annika was sitting on the steps, watching her with the kind of tired affection that had softened over time into something steadier. Michael stood there for a moment, taking it in. "This is new," he said. "No," I replied. "It's just recent." He nodded, though I'm not sure he fully understood. We sat at the table, the same table that had once held so much waiting. It felt different now because I was different at it. I was not measuring the moment against all the times he had not been there. I was simply in it. He told me about his week, work, the usual complications, small frustrations that felt large in the moment. I listened, not because I needed to be needed, but because I wanted to hear him. That is another difference. When you stop needing something from someone, you are finally able to meet them where they are, not where you wish they would be. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You seem good." "I am," I said, and I meant it in a way I had not meant it before. Not good because things had improved around me. Not good because I had received more attention or more effort or more proof of love. Good because my life was no longer dependent on those things to feel complete. Patricia noticed too. She called more often, at first tentatively, as if testing whether I would respond the same way I always had. I did not fill the conversations with everything I had been holding in. I did not rush to use the time as proof that I mattered. I spoke to her the way I would speak to anyone I valued. Present, but not grasping. She visited a month later, stayed longer than usual, asked questions she had not asked before. And I could see it, the same thing I had heard in Michael's voice. Interest. Not because I had demanded it, because I had become someone who was no longer waiting to be chosen. That is what I want you to understand. You cannot make your children come by calling them more, by reminding them, by quietly rearranging yourself into something easier to include. That path leads to a smaller and smaller version of you, one that is eventually so easy to overlook that even you begin to lose sight of it. But if you stop, truly stop, not in anger, not in silence meant to punish, but in a genuine decision to live your life without organizing it around their attention, something shifts. In you first, and then, sometimes, in them. Not always in the way you expect, not always in the timing you would choose, but enough. Enough to remind you that you are not here to be remembered when it is convenient. You are here to be lived, fully, specifically, while you still can. I am 91 years old. My hands are not as steady as they once were. My steps require more care. There are mornings when my body reminds me, quite clearly, that time is not something I have in unlimited supply. But my days are mine, not because they are full of people, because they are full of me. And that, in the end, is why they come. Not because I asked, because there is something here worth coming to. There is one more thing I have not told you. Not because I was hiding it, but because I did not understand it clearly enough to explain it until now. Some lessons arrive in pieces, and you only see the full shape of them after you have lived with them for a while. When I stopped begging, I thought I was only changing my relationship with my children. I was wrong. I was changing my relationship with myself. For most of my life, I understood my value through what I provided to other people. That was how I was raised, and in many ways it served me well. I built a family. I supported a husband. I held things together when they threatened to come apart. There is dignity in that kind of life. There is meaning in it. But there is also a risk. If you are not careful, you begin to believe that your usefulness only exists in response to someone else's need. And when those needs change, as they always do, you are left standing in a space that feels unfamiliar, wondering where you went. That is what happened to me. Not all at once, not in a way that anyone could point to and say, "There, that is the moment you disappeared." It was gradual, subtle, wrapped in ordinary days that looked perfectly fine from the outside, until one day I realized that I had become someone who was waiting to be needed. That is a fragile place to build a life, because need is unpredictable. It comes and goes. It shifts from one person to another. It rarely stays where you expect it to, and it almost never aligns with your own sense of timing. So when I say do not beg, I am not only talking about your children. I am talking about the deeper habit of placing your worth in someone else's hands and hoping they remember to hold it carefully. That is too much responsibility for anyone. Even the people who love you. Especially the people who love you. It does not always express itself in frequency or consistency. Sometimes it exists quietly, in the background, assumed rather than demonstrated. That can be painful. But it is also true. And once you accept that truth, you are left with a choice. You can spend your time trying to convert that love into the form you prefer, calling more, asking more, adjusting yourself in the hope that it will be returned in a way that feels satisfying. Or you can accept it as it is, and build something alongside it that does not depend on it. That is what I did. And I want to be very clear about something. This is not a story about independence in the way people like to talk about it, as if the goal is to need no one and nothing. That is not only unrealistic, it is undesirable. We are not meant to exist in isolation. We are meant to connect, to share, to be part of each other's lives in ways that matter. But connection built on quiet desperation is not connection. It is negotiation. And I was tired of negotiating for space in the lives of people who already loved me. So I stopped. I let the love exist without trying to manage it. And I turned my attention to what I could create. Not in a grand sense. I did not start a business, or write a book, or reinvent myself in some dramatic way that would make for a better story. I did something much smaller. I became consistent. Consistent in how I spent my time. Consistent in how I showed up for the people who were present. Consistent in how I treated my own life as something worth engaging with, even when no one was watching. There is power in that kind of consistency. It builds something solid, something that doesn't shift depending on who calls, or who visits, or who remembers. And people feel that. They may not be able to explain it. They may not even be aware of it consciously, but they respond to it. Because a person who is fully in their own life is different from a person who is waiting at the edge of someone else's. One invites, the other asks. And invitations are far more compelling. Michael stays longer now when he visits. Not always. He still has a life that pulls him in many directions. That has not changed, and I no longer expect it to. But when he is here in a way that feels more complete. Patricia calls, not out of obligation, but because she wants to tell me things. Not everything. I am not her entire world, nor should I be. But enough that I feel included, not inserted. And Lena, well, Lena does not know any of this. To her, I am simply someone who is there. Someone who answers her questions. Someone who listens. Someone who exists in her world without needing to be justified. And there is something very honest about that. Children do not respond to who you used to be. They respond to who you are. Perhaps that is why this works. Because I am no longer asking to be remembered for who I was to my children. I am simply being who I am, in the present, with whoever is here to meet me in it. So if you are sitting there, wondering whether you should call again, whether you should try harder, whether you should find a better way to remind your children that you are still here, let me save you some time. They already know. The question is not whether they remember you. The question is whether you remember yourself. Because once you do, once you return to your own life fully and without apology, everything else begins to rearrange itself around that truth. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. And enough, I have learned, is more than sufficient for a life that is still being lived.